For 7 years, Dino Finch accepted the official story. His son, Owen, a man who had summited peaks across the continent, had made a fatal misstep in the Sierra Nevadas. But when a geologist's email arrives with an attachment, a photo of a muddy yellow water bottle found miles from any searched trail, the grief Dino had buried erupts into suspicion. The bottle was Owen's, but the location makes no sense, and it forces Dino to question the one person who was with his son that day, his trusted climbing partner. It's amazing how a single image, a small digital file, can change the course of a quiet life. Before you listen to Dino's story, let us know in the comments if you believe a parent's intuition is one of the most powerful forces on Earth. The silence in Dino's house was a carefully maintained thing. For a retired architect, structure was everything, and the structure of his days was built around quiet routine. Coffee at dawn, reading the paper, a long walk through the silent pines surrounding his home, and then hours spent at his drafting table, not designing buildings, but sketching mountains from memory. They were Owen's mountains. Each pencil stroke was a tribute, a prayer, a way to keep his son's memory from fading into the fog of the past. 7 years had passed since the call came. Owen was gone. A sudden blizzard on Widow's Peak. His climbing partner Julian Thorne had explained through a haze of shock and grief. A slip on an icy ledge. They had searched for weeks, but the mountain had claimed him. Dino accepted it because he had to. The alternative was a gaping void of unanswered questions, a place too dark to enter. He maintained a civil, if distant, relationship with Julian. They would meet for a somber coffee on the anniversary of Owen's disappearance. Two men bound by a shared loss. Julian had taken over their small company, Apex Minerals, and turned it into a modest success, something he said was a tribute to Owen's vision. Dino never pried. It was easier that way. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, interrupting his sketch of the Sawtooth Ridge Owen had loved so much. The subject line was innocuous. Question about found item, Sierra Nevada. The sender was a Dr. Eris Thorne, a name he didn't recognize. He opened it, his curiosity mild. The text was brief, from a geology PhD student named Lena Eris. She explained she was conducting a geological survey for her thesis in a remote part of the Sierra Nevadas, far from the popular trails. She had found a water bottle that looked like it had been there for a long time and thought it might belong to a missing hiker. She had seen the Everest Base Camp sticker, and, through a quick online search of missing hikers in the area with mountaineering experience, had found an old news article about Owen. She attached a photo. Dino's breath caught in his throat. The photo was clear. A bright yellow bottle, caked in mud, lying amongst shattered shale. And there, unmistakable, was the sticker Owen had proudly slapped on it the day he returned from Nepal. It was his hero bottle, the one that had been with him on his greatest achievement. Dino's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened a new tab and pulled up a map. The email mentioned the location, near the abandoned Lucky Strike mine. He found it, a tiny marker in a desolate canyon. Then he searched for Widow's Peak. The two locations were nearly 30 miles apart, separated by a brutal, almost impassable landscape of canyons and ravines. There was no scenario in which Owen could have been on Widow's Peak and his bottle ended up at the Lucky Strike mine. An animal couldn't have dragged it that far over such terrain. A flood couldn't have carried it there. The 2 points were on different watersheds. The foundation of the story Dino had built his grief upon crumbled in an instant. The quiet room suddenly felt charged with electricity. 7 years of accepted tragedy evaporated, replaced by the sharp metallic taste of suspicion. He had a new purpose. It wasn't just to remember his son anymore. It was to find out what really happened to him. And that meant he had to understand why Owen's bottle was lying in the mud 30 miles from where he was supposed to have died. His first call was to the number Lena Aris had left in her email. A bright, professional voice answered on the second ring. Dino, his own voice tight with emotion, explained who he was. Lena was immediately sympathetic and confirmed everything. "I'm still out in the field for another day, Mr. Finch," she said. "I left the bottle where I found it, marked the coordinates. I figured it was evidence. I can meet you here tomorrow if you want to see the location for yourself." Dino agreed without hesitation. The 8-hour drive felt like a pilgrimage. He drove through the night, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a mantra against the questions screaming in his mind. The landscape changed from the familiar pines of his home to the stark granite grandeur of the high Sierras. The area around the Lucky Strike mine was nothing like the pictures he'd seen of Widow's Peak. This was not a climber's paradise of vertical ice and challenging ascents. It was a geologist's dream. Exposed rock faces, old tailing piles, and the dark, ominous mouths of abandoned mine shafts. Lena was waiting for him at the designated turnoff, a young woman with kind eyes and the practical, no-nonsense air of a field scientist. She led him down a rough track to a dry wash, the air thick with the smell of dust and sun-baked rock. "It was over here," she said, pointing toward a recent rock slide at the base of a cliff. "I was taking samples when I saw the color, and there it was, the yellow bottle, a bright slash of color against the gray and brown earth." Dino knelt, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. It was real. This place was real. But the story of the fall was not. This wasn't a place for a mountaineering accident. It was a place to get lost. It was a place to disappear. He thanked Lena, his voice thick. She seemed to understand that he needed a moment alone. As he stood there, staring at the bottle, he knew what his next step had to be. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Julian Thorne's name. He needed to hear his voice, to gauge his reaction. He tried to compose himself, to make the call sound like a strange, unimportant curiosity. Julian answered with his usual smooth, confident tone. "Dino, good to hear from you. Everything all right?" "Yes, Julian, fine," Dino began, forcing a casualness he didn't feel. "Listen, the strangest thing happened. A student out in the mountains found one of Owen's water bottles." There was a brief pause. "Really? After all this time? Where?" Julian's voice was a mask of polite interest. "Near that old, abandoned mine, the Lucky Strike," Dino said, watching a lizard skitter across a rock. The silence on the other end of the line was longer this time. When Julian finally spoke, his voice had changed. There was a new edge to it, a faint tremor of something that sounded like annoyance. "The Lucky Strike? That's impossible, Dino. We were nowhere near there. Must be a mistake. Or maybe an animal dragged it off. You know how scavengers are." "An animal couldn't have taken it 30 miles across 2 canyons, Julian," Dino said flatly. The lie was so obvious, so insulting. "Well, I don't know what to tell you," Julian snapped, his composure cracking. "It's been 7 years. Things get moved around. Frankly, I think it's unhealthy to dwell on these things. Owen is gone. Finding an old piece of his gear doesn't change that." The call ended soon after, but the conversation replayed in Dino's mind. Julian hadn't been surprised or curious. He had been defensive, dismissive, and then hostile. He wasn't grieving a lost friend. He was managing a threat. When Dino returned home, he walked straight past his drafting table and into Owen's room. For 7 years, it had been a museum. Now it was a crime scene. He started pulling boxes from the closet, items he hadn't had the strength to face before. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was an investigator. He unrolled Owen's climbing maps, spreading them across the floor. He found the one for the Widow's Peak expedition. It was marked with their planned route, just as Julian had described. But tucked inside the map's sleeve was another, smaller, topographical map of the Lucky Strike mine area. It was covered in Owen's familiar, precise handwriting, with notes on geological formations and circled areas marked with chemical symbols. Dano's heart began to race. He moved to Owen's desk, powering on the old computer. He started opening files, and that's when he remembered Apex Minerals. Julian had always described it as a side project, a bit of fun for two guys who loved rocks as much as they loved climbing. Dino found the company's business folder. It wasn't a hobby. It was a serious venture. There were geological survey reports, incorporation documents, and a detailed business plan. The plan was to seek major investors for what the document called a significant, high-yield deposit of rare earth elements. Dino scanned the document, his eyes searching for a location. And then he found it, on page 12, under the heading Primary Asset. The deposit, rich in an element called neodymium, was located in a 60-acre block of land. The land that directly surrounded the Lucky Strike mine. The trip to Widow's Peak wasn't just a climb, it was a cover story. Owen's final expedition had been to the mine, to the site of a discovery that was worth a fortune, and Julian had lied about every single part of it. The truth was buried somewhere in that desolate canyon, and Dino knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was buried along with his son. The weight of the discovery settled on Dino like a physical shroud. Owen hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had been silenced. The prospecting venture, the rare earth minerals, Julian's elaborate lie, it all pointed to a motive as old as the mountains themselves, greed. But suspicion wasn't proof. Dino knew that if he went to the police now, with only a water bottle and an old business plan, Julian would deny everything. He'd call Dino a delusional old man, lost in his grief. He needed something undeniable, something that tied Julian to that location and to Owen's disappearance. He needed a smoking gun. He spent the next 2 days immersed in Owen's digital life, a world he had only ever peripherally known. Owen had been meticulous, a digital native who believed in backups for his backups. The problem was, he also believed in encryption. Dino was confronted with password prompts on encrypted hard drives and cloud storage accounts he didn't even know existed. He felt a wave of despair. The answers were right there, locked away behind a wall of code he couldn't break. Defeated, he slumped back in Owen's desk chair. His eyes fell on a shelf of books above the desk. They were Owen's favorites, a mix of climbing memoirs and classic literature. His gaze settled on a worn, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick, a book Dino had given him for his 21st birthday. He pulled it down, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. As he idly flipped through the pages, a small black notebook fell out from between the leaves. It was one of those simple, pocket-sized notebooks. Dino opened it. The pages were filled with what looked like gibberish, random phrases, strings of numbers, and odd combinations of words. The white whale swims at midnight. Ishmael's Folly, 1851. Pequod Starbuck. It seemed like nonsense, until Dino's mind made a connection. He looked at the cloud service login page on the computer screen. The username was Captain Ahab. He looked back at the notebook. The phrases weren't random, they were password keys. He began to type. Ishmael's Folly, 1851. Access denied. He tried another. Pequod Starbuck. Access granted. He was in. The cloud server was organized with Owen's typical precision. There were folders for photos, documents, and research. One folder stood out, labeled simply, LS Geodata. LS Lucky Strike. His hands shaking, Dino clicked it open. It was all there. Dozens of files containing soil sample analyses, spectrometer readings, and detailed geological maps of the claim. There was also a subfolder named GPS Tracks. He opened it and found a single file. It was a complete GPS log of Owen's final days. Dino watched as the track painted itself across the map on his screen. It showed Owen and a second person. It had to be Julian, driving to the trailhead near the mine. It showed them hiking for 2 days, methodically moving in a grid pattern across the claim, their paths overlapping as they took samples. The data was a silent witness to Owen's last living moments. Then, Dino saw the final file in the folder. It wasn't a data log. It was a text document, an unsent email. He opened it. The recipient was an attorney specializing in intellectual property and corporate law. The email was dated the day before Owen disappeared. Dino read the words, his heart pounding a funeral drum in his chest. Mark, the email began. Following our conversation, this is formal notice of my intent to dissolve my partnership with Julian Thorne in Apex Minerals. I have discovered conclusive evidence that he has been misrepresenting our findings to potential investors and attempting to file for the mineral rights solely under his own name. His unethical behavior has created a fundamental conflict of interest I cannot ignore. I will be back in town on Friday to sign the necessary paperwork. I've attached the final validation data for the claim. Regards, Owen. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Owen had discovered Julian's betrayal. He was going to cut him out of the deal of a lifetime. The GPS track on the map ended abruptly at the edge of a deep ravine on the north side of the claim. It just stopped. There was no return journey. This was the proof, undeniable, digital, and damning. Dino knew he couldn't confront Julian. A man who would kill his partner over a mineral claim wouldn't hesitate to silence a grieving father who had uncovered his secret. He carefully copied all the files onto a new thumb drive. His mission had changed once more. He was no longer just an investigator. He was the keeper of his son's final words, and he was going to deliver them to the only people who could bring him justice. He drove to the county sheriff's department the next morning. The sheriff, who had handled Owen's case 7 years ago, had long since retired. The new sheriff, a woman named Carver, listened patiently as Dino laid out the story, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside him. He didn't present it as a theory. He presented it as a timeline, a sequence of facts, starting with the water bottle and ending with the unsent email. He handed her the thumb drive. Sheriff Carver looked at the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each file she opened. She made a few calls. Within an hour, the office was buzzing with quiet, focused activity. She turned back to Dino. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "We're treating this as a homicide investigation. We'll be obtaining a warrant to search the area indicated by your son's GPS data. We'd like you to stay here. We'll keep you updated." Waiting was the hardest part. Hours crawled by. Finally, late in the afternoon, Sheriff Carver returned. Her face was grim. "We found him, Mr. Finch," she said gently. "A team with cadaver dogs located a clandestine grave, not far from where the GPS track ended. The remains are consistent with your son's description. The county coroner is on site. The preliminary finding is that the cause of death was not a fall. It was blunt force trauma to the head." The words were clinical, but they landed on Dino with the force of a physical blow. He had known, but hearing it confirmed was a new kind of agony. "We have a team on their way to bring Julian Thorne in for questioning now," Carver continued. "Your son's data gives us everything we need. He won't be able to lie his way out of this." Julian was arrested at his office an hour later. The news report said he was taken completely by surprise. Faced with the GPS logs, the business plan, the unsent email, and the discovery of Owen's body, he confessed. He told the police how Owen had confronted him at the campsite about his plan to steal the claim. They argued. Owen told him their partnership was over. In a fit of rage, Julian picked up a heavy rock from their campfire ring and struck him from behind. He buried Owen in a shallow grave, then drove to Widow's Peak, ditched Owen's truck, and hiked out in the approaching blizzard, calling for help and spinning his tale of a tragic climbing accident. For 7 years, the story held. For 7 years, he had built a life on the profits from the mine, the same mine where he had murdered his partner. A week later, Dino held a proper funeral for Owen. It was a small service, attended by a few close friends and family. He scattered his son's ashes from a cliff overlooking the ocean, a place Owen had loved. In the months that followed, Dino worked with a university to establish the Owen Finch Grant for Ethical Geological Prospecting. He used the initial profits from the now-seized mineral claim to fund a scholarship for students who, like his son, had a passion for discovery, but who, unlike Julian, understood that integrity was worth more than any precious metal buried in the earth. The silence in Dino's house was different now. It was no longer a hollow emptiness. It was a quiet peace, the kind that comes from a long, difficult job finally done. He still sketched mountains at his drafting table, but now he was able to draw his son smiling at the summit, finally at rest. If you were Dino and found the damning evidence on Owen's computer, would you have been tempted to confront the killer yourself? Or was going straight to the police the only logical choice? We create these stories to explore the depths of human resolve and the search for truth. If you found value in this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel and becoming part of a community that appreciates these powerful narratives. Thank you for listening.